All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're attempting something absolutely massive, a chronological speed run of human history. We are literally going to narrate every single major event, starting from the very first cities ever built, all the way to the tense, heavily armed brink of the world wars. It's going to be a wild ride, so let's see exactly how we got to where we are today. Here's our agenda for today. 1. The first ancient civilizations. 2. Classical empires and religions. 3. The Middle Ages and Mongols. 4. Exploration, conquest, and rebirth. And 5. Revolutions and industrial empires. Let's jump right in. Section 1. The first ancient civilizations. We're starting right in the Middle East, specifically between two rivers in modern-day Iraq, which is exactly where the very first human cities and organized societies first emerged. So right in the middle of these early cities, you've got priests building these giant, pyramid-shaped towers. They're mapping rectangles of stars in the sky and offering drinks to their gods. The ancient Sumerians actually divided our days into hours, minutes, and seconds. And crucially, they invented writing. Then a king named Sargon looks around and thinks, it's pretty inefficient for every city to have its own king, so he just conquers them all and builds the very first empire. Not for the people, mind you, but for his own pride and power. At the exact same time, Egyptians are building pyramids, the Minoans are painting, and the Indus River Valley has these highly organized cities with perfectly straight roads and writing we still can't decipher today. After Sargon, Hammurabi comes along and literally writes his famous laws on a giant rock. But then, boom, a massive, mysterious collapse hits. All these Bronze Age empires just fall apart at roughly the same time, ushering us right into the Iron Age. Now, during this ancient era, a very specific lineage really starts to take shape. Over in the Middle East, a man named Abraham had descendants who became the ancestors of the Arabs of Central Arabia, and another line that led to the 12 sons who became the Israelites. The Israelites end up in Egypt, become enslaved until a guy named Moses leads them out to a mountain where they receive the 10 Commandments. Fast forward a bit, and King David conquers the region. Well, except for the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were just too busy building ships, sailing absolutely everywhere, and brilliantly inventing the alphabet. I mean, they literally took their word for ox, elep, and their word for house, bet, combined the starting sounds, and bam, they gave us the alphabet. We actually have proof they were using this over 3,500 years ago on an ancient lice comb. It was just such a genius idea that everyone else ended up copying it. Moving along, the map starts getting pretty chaotic. The Assyrians conquer everyone, only to immediately get conquered themselves by the Babylonians. Then, a Persian named Cyrus the Great sweeps in. He takes down the Medes, the Babylonians, and the Lydians. But here's what's wild. While all these empires are clashing in the Middle East, massive philosophical shifts are happening at the exact same time in the East. Over in India, a prince named Siddhartha Gautama sees suffering, almost starves himself as a monk, decides to eat a nice meal, sits under a tree, and becomes enlightened, founding Buddhism. And over in China, you've got Confucius teaching people to be nice and rule well, while Laozi is teaching everyone to just kind of go with the flow. Section 2. Classical Empires and Religions. Now, this is where massive geopolitical powers really start clashing, and the foundations of major world faiths truly take root. Over in the Mediterranean, the Greeks are playing sports at the Olympics to honor Zeus, and Athens invents democracy. But they end up making the Persians really mad by burning the city of Sardis. So the Persians try to burn Athens, completely get slaughtered at Marathon, and have to come back later. Meanwhile, Greek thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are paving the way for Alexander the Great. Alexander basically takes revenge on the Persians, conquers the known world, decides he's a god, and then promptly dies. His generals just divide up the empire. Now in the East, the Parthians start expanding, but in the West, it's the Romans who are on the rise. The Romans actually survive Hannibal showing up in Italy with literal elephants. They defeat Carthage, and leaders like Julius Caesar conquer even more land. Julius even makes our calendar, adding a few too many leap years, actually. And after some messy civil wars involving Cleopatra and Mark Antony, Augustus Caesar ends up ruling everything as the very first emperor of the Roman Empire. Within that sprawling Roman Empire, a massive shift occurs, the emergence of Christianity. A man named Jesus says he's the anointed king, so the Romans crucify him. But 3 days later, his body is missing, and his followers report seeing him alive. A guy named Paul, who actually started out persecuting Christians, says he saw Jesus too, and he travels everywhere spreading the faith. When the Romans outlaw the Jewish religion, Christians try to distance themselves, but the Romans still persecute them fiercely. We're talking burning them and feeding them to lions. But here's the crazy part. Dying these horrible deaths actually makes Christianity more popular. Emperor Diocletian tries outlawing it entirely, but eventually, Constantine takes over, legalizes it, and gathers everyone at a massive council so they can all finally agree on exactly what they believe. Meanwhile, incredible shifts are happening all across Asia. Austronesian peoples are sailing from island to island, eventually reaching Madagascar, Hawaii, and New Zealand. In China, there's this endless cycle of dynasties, the Shang, Zhou, Qin, Han, Jin, and Tang. Sometimes they're united, sometimes they're split into 16 different Chinas. They're building massive walls to keep people out, and, crucially, they invent paper, printing, and are actually the very first to use toilet paper. This is while the Romans were still wiping with sponges on sticks, mind you. Down in India, the Maurya Empire is enlarged by King Ashoka. After a massive killing spree, Ashoka becomes a Buddhist and sends missionaries everywhere to basically tell people to stop killing each other. Later on, the Gupta Empire brings a golden age to India, and Indian traders spread Hinduism and Buddhism all throughout Southeast Asia, China, Korea, and Japan. Section 3. The Middle Ages and the Mongols. The classical powers fall, and the map gets wildly chaotic as the Mongols change absolutely everything. This era is really defined by a massive global split. Arab clans had been fighting each other for centuries, but that totally changes when Muhammad says he received revelations from the God of Abraham. He unites the Arabs under Islam. And because they are allowed to fight each other anymore, they basically fight everyone else, rapidly conquering the largest empire the world had ever seen. But as this massive Islamic empire expands up into Europe, they get stopped by the Franks, led by Charles the Hammer. His grandson, Charlemagne, is eventually crowned by the Pope as the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, forging a European power that would stick around for 1,000 years. So while the big empires stabilize, the edges of the map get totally wild. Up north, the Vikings just start stealing everyone's stuff, settling in Russia, England, Normandy, Iceland, and yes, Greenland. Which, by the way, was basically a completely absurd false advertising scam to trick people into moving to a frozen rock. Way over in Central Asia, Turkic groups like the Khazars, Uyghurs, and Seljuks are rising. The Seljuks end up converting to Islam and start aggressively conquering, eventually hammering away at the Orthodox Byzantine Empire. Because the Byzantines are getting hammered, they actually ask the Catholics for help. The Pope tells Christians they can be forgiven for their sins if they go fight a holy war, which kicks off a bloody domino effect of crusades in the Holy Land. They plunder and kill until they're finally pushed back by the Kurdish Sultan Saladin and the Mamluks. Now, the Mamluks also managed to stop the Mongols from expanding south. But wait, how did the Mongols even get there? Well, Genghis Khan just decided to conquer twice as much land as Alexander the Great, and then the Mongols went ahead and doubled their territory again. But this massive, interconnected Mongol empire likely helped spread a huge tragedy, the Black Death, which quickly wipes out at least a third of Europe's entire population. Section 4. Exploration, Conquest, and Rebirth. Emerging from the plague, Europe hits a cultural renaissance and immediately sets sail to forcefully connect the entire globe. Events start accelerating incredibly fast now. Gutenberg invents the printing press with movable type and immediately starts printing Bibles. Meanwhile, in Spain, Ferdinand launches the Spanish Inquisition to burn heretics and check if Jewish Catholics are secretly keeping the Sabbath. They kick out anyone who won't convert, right in time for the Age of Exploration. While the Portuguese sail around Africa looking for spices, Columbus takes a shortcut west and completely stumbles upon the Americas. Now, Native Americans had been living there since the oceans were lower, building giant pyramids in Peru. But the Spanish arrive, see the pyramid building, human-sacrificing Aztecs and Incas, conquer them entirely and siphon all their gold, silver, and foods right back to Europe. To avoid fighting over all this new global wealth, Spain and Portugal literally just divide the world in half. While Spain exploits the Americas, Portugal bypasses the ancient Silk Road to build a massive trading empire in Asia. But they also initiate this grim, mechanistic loop. Portuguese traders sail ships full of European goods down to Africa, trade those goods for enslaved human beings, trade the enslaved people for food, and then trade that food back to Europe for more goods. Rinse and repeat. It was just the brutal commercialization of human lives for European profit. Back in Europe, religion sparks massive rebellions. A German Catholic priest named Martin Luther uses the shiny new printing press to become history's very first mass media influencer. He protests the Catholic Church and kicks off the Protestant Reformation. Over in England, King Henry VIII wants a new wife so he can get a son. The Pope says no, so Henry just creates a Protestant England entirely so he can marry and, eventually behead multiple wives. Because of all these religious disputes, Northern Europe really rises up. The newly freed Dutch dominate the seas, capturing the spice trade and painting completely overpriced tulips, all while English pirates are busy robbing the Spanish. Section 5. Revolutions and Industrial Empires. In our final era, industrial steam power and colonial greed ignite a relentless chain reaction of global revolutions. Let's see how this exact logical sequence builds right into a global revolution. France and Britain fight what is essentially World War Zero over colonies. Britain wins, but they go into deep debt. So what do? They tax the Americans. The Americans hate the taxes and start the American Revolution. France jumps in to help the Americans beat Britain. France succeeds, but now they are in debt. So the French king taxes his people. The French people hate the taxes, leading to the French Revolution, which ultimately paves the way for Napoleon to seize power and try to conquer Europe. And this whole sequence inspires Simon Bolivar to lead a wave of revolutions all across Latin America. Britain, meanwhile, decides to have an industrial revolution. Using steam power, they start making things faster and cheaper, and they need places to sell it all, so they build the Second British Empire. The sheer scope of this is staggering. They send criminals to establish Australia, and loyalists head to Canada. Because they control the seas, they actually outlaw the seaborne slave trade. But simultaneously, the British East India Company is systematically taking over all of India from the crumbling Mughal Empire. They then take opium from India, sell it to drug dealers in China, and when China tries to stop them, the British Navy violently forces the issue in the Opium Wars and just seizes Hong Kong. Right before the 20th century, simultaneous shifts just completely rock the globe. In China, Christian missionary ideas lead a man to believe he's the literal brother of Jesus Christ. He sparks the Taiping Rebellion, leaving a horrifying 30 million dead. The growing United States shows up with warships and forces Japan to end its isolation. Russia, having unconquered itself from the Mongols, claims to be the third Rome. Ivan the Terrible takes the title of Tsar, and Russia massively expands across Asia. They even discover Antarctica's penguins 3 days before the British. Meanwhile, both Italy and Germany finally unite into distinct new nations, and they immediately decide they want colonies just like all the other cool powers. Which brings us to Africa. Europeans start using this distorted social Darwinism, basically claiming humans evolved from pond slime, so Europeans are somehow the fittest to survive and rule, as an excuse to invade. But before we get into the scramble, we absolutely must impartially recognize the massive array of complex African empires that successfully occupied the continent long before Europeans even arrived. From Egypt and Kush to the builders of Great Zimbabwe, the Kingdom of Congo, and the Zulus, Africa was fully occupied by highly complex societies. Yet, despite that reality, Germany's Bismarck calls a conference and makes this absurd, rather pompous claim. He says, wait, we need rules. First, you can't claim anything that's already claimed, and second, you can't claim anything you don't occupy. This was a completely hypocritical framework. The race had officially begun. The Italians invaded, the Belgians butchered, the Germans set up bases, and the French and British relentlessly colonized a continent that was, frankly, already fully claimed and occupied by its own people. Through all this, Britain emerges as the biggest empire in human history. And that brings us right to the precipice. All these great powers are aggressively expanding, but there's literally nowhere left to expand, except into the territory of the crumbling Ottoman Empire. And now, everyone is inventing crazy, deadly new technologies. We're talking telegraphs, airplanes, battleships, submarines. So I leave you with this provocative question to take away. With all these thousands of interconnected historical events, fueled by dangerous new tech and aggressively overlapping empires, what happens next? How does this culminate? The stage is perfectly, tragically, set for the inevitable explosion of the world wars. Understanding this breakneck sequence